In prior videos, we've talked a lot about some of the best titles in wrestling, and more specifically, we've talked about some of the best main event level belts to be found in WWE. But of course, there's been a lot more than just main event belts over the years. No, WWE have had a whole host of great mid-card titles too, but which are the biggest and best of them all? Well, that's what we're going to be looking at right now, starting with the Intercontinental title. Yes, perhaps the most famous and highly regarded mid-card title in all of wrestling history, the Intercontinental title has a proud lineage which goes all the way back to September of 1979. This was the point where, in WWE canon at least, it was first contested over in a tournament held in Rio de Janeiro, a tournament which was ultimately won by Pat Patterson. Of course, this tournament never happened though. No, in truth, the IC title, emerging of the South American and original North American championships, would simply be awarded to Patterson as he began showing up at live events with it. Where would it go after this inaugural reign? Well, great places, because by the time the 80s came around, the IC strap had gained a reputation as being the workhorse prize of the WWF, the belt that great in-ring workers who could go would hold on to. Names like Ricky the Dragon Steamboat, Mr. Perfect, and Macho Man Randy Savage. Sadly though, as the decades went, the Intercontinental title would lose much of its luster, and that's why we're so thankful then that in recent years, Gunther has been able to do an excellent job of reviving its fortunes with his record-breaking run. And this has meant that, as things stand today, it's a lot closer to where it was in the 80s, as it's now a prize which can feel like a worthwhile one for people such as Sami Zayn, Jey Uso, and Braun Breaker to chase after. Of course, in recent years, the Intercontinental title's legacy has expanded even further because, as of 2024, it's no longer just a men's prize. And no, we're not talking about that one brief period where China held it during the late 90s. Rather, we're talking about the fact that we now have a female-only version too in the women's Intercontinental title. How did this one come about? Well, as part of the ongoing push to take women's wrestling to the next level, over the last decade or so, WWE has been great at taking things that would have usually been men's only and giving the ladies a chance to get involved too. We're talking about things like the Women's Royal Rumble and the Women's Money in the Bank ladder match here. One thing they hadn't done until very recently, though, was introduce women's mid-card belts. Why was this? Well, it was partially because, unlike the men's roster, which is always filled with talent, the women's division in WWE had always been pretty light in numbers by comparison. And so it really didn't make any sense to add any new belts into the equation, especially when you had world titles across both Raw and SmackDown. But with more ladies being added to the roster as of late and more promising talents like Julia and Stephanie Vaquer currently working their way up the ranks of NXT, it finally made sense for the females of the mid-card to get their own prize to fight over too. Enter the Women's Intercontinental title, a Raw exclusive belt that was first announced in the winter of 2024. With the women's World Heavyweight title scene being dominated by the likes of Rhea Ripley and Liv Morgan, this gave the other ladies there something to fight over. The only question left then was who would be the first person to hold the belt, and the answer to that would be the winner of a tournament that was to be held across the Red brand that December. Yes, over a series of weeks, the likes of Dakota Kai, Shayna Baszler, Zoe Stark, Zelina Vega, and Io Sky, just to name a few, would all throw their names in the hat to be the first ever women's Intercontinental champion. But in the end, it would be none of these people who won it. Rather, it would be Dublin's own Lyra Valkyria, and as things stand today, she's still the person in possession of it as she defends it against all comers over on Raw. Where will the belt go from here? That remains to be seen. Maybe it'll turn into something just as valuable as the men's Intercontinental title is, or maybe it'll become something less noteworthy. It's really all down to a combination of the booking and the people holding it. But with the talent level of the women's mid-card division on Monday nights being strong, and with there being plenty of people ready to step up from developmental and join that fray anytime now, we expect that this won't be an issue. But what of SmackDown? If Raw has their own mid-card women's belt, then surely the Blue brand has one of their own too, right? Why, yes they do, and that belt is our next entry, in fact, the Women's United States title. What's the story with this one? It's the same as the Women's Intercontinental title. And this is that, with their roster of ladies expanding and many needing something to do when they weren't going after the world title, it was decided in late 2024 that it was time to introduce mid-card belts for the girls to fight over on both brands. And while this meant a female version of the IC strap being introduced on Monday nights, on Fridays, it meant a women's US belt being brought in instead. That's right, the belt, which has a proud lineage going back even further than the Intercontinental title, was now going to have a ladies-only equivalent. The only question was, like with the mid-card women's belt on Raw, who was going to serve as the first champion? And the answer to that would be whoever won the tournament designed to crown the inaugural holder. To the surprise of no one, then, every woman on the blue brand who wasn't currently in possession of a world title wanted in on this tournament. And that was why the brackets would end up including names such as Bayley, Bianca Belair, and Tiffany Stratton, just to name a few. But in the end, it would be none other than Chelsea Green that came out on top. And this meant the mid-card belt of the blue brand was going to be characterized by entertaining segments as well as great matches. And this has worked out great so far, as to this day she remains the only person to hold the prize. No matter who wins it next though, we've no doubt there will be a lot of stories to be told with this one as the years progress, and a lot of memorable moments because the women's division is getting better and better. So expect to see names like Stephanie Vaquer or Cora Jade making a push for it once they get their inevitable call-ups. Will it ever reach the heights of its male equivalent though? Well, that's the next belt we're going to be looking at as it happens, the Men's United States Championship. Of course, this one didn't start off life in WWE. No, the history of the United States title goes all the way back to the territory days of the National Wrestling Alliance, as that's when it was one of the top mid-card belts sanctioned by this governing body. And because things were a little different back then, and it was more common to see true main event talent go after such belts when they weren't chasing the world title, this meant some of the early names to hold it were legends such as Ric Flair, Harley Race, Terry Funk, and Roddy Piper. That said, as the years went on and the territories died out, the United States title became more of a specific belt to Jim Crockett Promotions. And when that company ended and was reborn as World Championship Wrestling during the late 80s, it would find a permanent home there instead. And this served as a launching pad for people like Sting and Booker T. And when WCW went under in 2001 and the US title was brought over to WWE, it would serve as an equally great launching pad for people like John Cena and Eddie Guerrero. Sure, it would suffer the same curse as the Intercontinental title did during the late 2000s and 2010s, as erratic booking made it feel less important than ever. But due to its legacy, it never went away completely. And this meant that once Big Match John held it again in 2015, it was able to feel totally rejuvenated. Yes, it's in a much better place than it once was, and that means the legends who once held it can all look at it with a little pride again, as whatever part of their legacies are tied up in it is rehabbed into a better place. But it's not all about the main roster in WWE. No, there's also their developmental brand NXT to consider too. After all, over the last decade or so, that brand has come on leaps and bounds to the point where, at times, it's been considered an outright third branch of the main roster. And like any true third branch of the main roster, this means it's been given its own mid-card titles, the first of which came along when the North American title was introduced in 2018. That said, this wasn't the first version of the North American title WWE ever had. No, as we mentioned earlier when we were talking about the origins of the Intercontinental belt, back in the 70s, there was a prize with this name which was contested over on WWF television, one which was held by the likes of Ted DiBiase pre-Million Dollar Man gimmick. But with that only being around for a short period of time, it's not the one we want to talk about today. Rather, we want to talk about the NXT title that was introduced during the late 2010s and which was named in honor of this older prize. Why did NXT choose to introduce a mid-card belt? Well, because this was arguably when the brand was at its peak. Yes, with this being the period that WWE's main roster was at one of its lowest ebbs creatively, NXT was considered one of the last bastions of good wrestling in North America. So realizing they had an absolutely stacked men's roster here, and only one singles title for them all to fight over, the decision was made to announce the debut of the NXT North American title in March of that year. And to show just how stacked this division was going to be, the inaugural champion was going to be determined in a six-man ladder match pitting some of the most exciting talents out there at the time against one another. We're talking about names like Ricochet, Killian Dane, and the Velveteen Dream here. In the end, though, it would be none of these who could call themselves the first champion. Rather, that honor would go to none other than Adam Cole, baby. Needless to say then, Cole went on to have a great run with this belt, fully establishing it as a title worth watching in the process. And once he was done with it, other great names such as Johnny Gargano, Keith Lee, and Isaiah Swerve Scott would only add to this reputation. And when NXT morphed into its 2.0 era, the North American title maintained its status as a great belt thanks to holders such as Carmelo Hayes, Wes Lee, and Trick Williams. As things stand today though, none of these men are in possession of it. No, instead it's Tony D'Angelo who's in the midst of his first reign. Will he be able to live up to the legacy of those who came before him? He's certainly looking great at the moment. And meanwhile, over in the women's division of NXT, that roster are also trying to establish their version of this prize, the recently introduced Women's North American title. That's right, it wasn't just the main roster that get mid-card belts added to their women's division in 2024. No, NXT would get the same. In fact, NXT were the first to do so, as they were introduced there in May of that year. And the reason they did so was the same as the reasons for Raw and SmackDown making such a move. The women's roster was growing at a fast pace, and there was a need for more prizes for the performers to fight over. Yes, it's been talked about a lot that NXT has the best women's division out there, and this may very well be true, as the show features names like Roxanne Perez, Julia, and Stephanie Vaquer. That said, with this level of talent being at the top of the card, it's meant it's been harder for up-and-coming names like Sol Ruca, Lola Vice, and Fallon Henley to break through and win some gold of their own. Or at least it was harder for them to do that until May of 2024, as now, with a Women's North American title to fight over, they've since found themselves with something else to chase after. Sure, none of the women we mentioned before would be the first person to hold said belt. Rather, that would be Kalani Jordan, who won it in a 6-woman ladder match at June 9th's Battleground. And ever since then, we've seen 2 more champions crowned, with those being Fallon Henley and Stephanie Vaquer. And as time goes on, we expect many more young talents to get their run with the secondary prize. And in doing so, we expect they'll all be moved up to that next level as they continue their path towards an eventual main roster debut. And once they're on either Raw or SmackDown, we imagine some new WWE ID or NIL talents will be brought in to take their place and hold the belt themselves for a while. Yes, the future of the Women's North American Championship is certainly a bright one, and that means it's not going to go anywhere anytime soon. Unfortunately, though, this is not the case with all mid-card titles in the WWE. No, some have their moment in the sun and then they fade away, eventually getting deactivated. And this is exactly what happened with our next entry, one of the more popular gimmick belts of the Attitude Era, the Hardcore title. Yes, this one goes back to the 90s, 1998 to be more precise. That was when, as a gift to the man who he was then supposedly grooming to be his next world champion, Vince McMahon awarded Mick Foley with a new belt, the Hardcore title. Why the Hardcore title? Well, it was a nod to all the wild hardcore bouts Mrs. Foley's baby boy had made his name on in places like WCW and Japan. Of course, Mankind wouldn't hold on to this one for long, though. No, quickly it would move on to people like the Big Boss Man and Hardcore Holly. And it was somewhere around this time that it got the gimmick which most fans remember it for today. That's right, we're talking about the 24/7 gimmick, the one which meant that if you were the Hardcore champion, you'd have to be ready to defend it at every moment of every day, because so long as someone had a referee with them, they could challenge you for it at any time, in any place. And this led to some completely wild segments as the new millennium dawned then, as the title would be defended in places like hotel rooms, backstage areas, and even children's jungle gyms. Of course, throughout most of this period, the man holding it would be Crash Holly, but Crash was far from the only person to call himself a notable hardcore champion during its run. No, as well as him, there would also be memorable runs from Raven, Steve Blackman, and even The Undertaker at one point. Alas, though, even this was not enough to see the belt avoid getting deactivated in 2002. Yes, it was here that after feeling like the whole thing had run its course and that there was no more juice left to squeeze from it, the Hardcore title would be merged with the Intercontinental title when Rob Van Dam won it in August of that year. But the Hardcore title was not the only memorable title from the Attitude Era which has since been deactivated. No, there were others too, others which remain fondly remembered by fans, and one of those is our next entry as it happens, the European title. How did this one come about? Well, it was back in February of 1997 that, looking to introduce something which could represent all of their fans in Europe, WWF decided to add a new piece of gold to their roster, with this one going by the name of the European Championship. And in order to find out who the inaugural holder of this belt was going to be, a tournament would be announced, a tournament which included the likes of Mankind, Rocky Maivia, Vader, Bret Hart, and Hunter Hearst Helmsley. Come the time of the finals on the February 26th episode of Raw that year, filmed from Germany, though, none of these men would be left remaining. No, by that point, the only ones to still be standing would be Owen Hart and his tag team partner, the British Bulldog. And in the end, it would be the latter who came out of that bout the victor, allowing him to go down in the history books as the first person to be the champion of Europe, at least in WWE. Where would he and the belt as a consequence go from here? Well, it would get a little controversial when Shawn Michaels won it from Davey Boy Smith in England a few months later. And after Shawn lost interest in it following that, the new prize sort of fell down the pecking order to the point that it was considered third tier at best. Still though, this didn't mean it didn't have some memorable moments as the years went on, or some memorable holders. No, at one point Shane McMahon himself would hold it, with this run pretty much serving as his introduction to the ring. And then of course there was the time Kurt Angle won it in 2000 and briefly merged it with the Intercontinental title to call himself Eurocontinental Champion, a feat which would only ever be matched once by D'Lo Brown. Yes, there was always plenty to talk about when we talked about the European Championship back then. Even as the 2000s got into full swing, in fact, names like Eddie Guerrero, Chris Jericho, and William Regal would continue to keep its legacy alive for longer than most expected. Alas though, like with the Hardcore title, this one would end up getting deactivated in 2002 when WWE decided to briefly get rid of every mid-card belt they had on their roster. And because of the unification lineage at play here, the last champion on record would go down as Rob Van Dam. Could the European title ever make a return in the future? It seems unlikely, as there's no real place for it anymore, and on top of that there isn't quite enough nostalgia associated with it to merit it being revived. But even if this is the case, it still remains a key part of WWE's legacy of mid-card prizes. Is it as big a part of their legacy as our next entry is though? Well, that's a subject represented not just by the mid-card in general, but a whole separate division. That's right, it's time to talk about the Cruiserweight title. Yes, it was back in March of 1996 that, with their weapon, their Cruiserweight division, growing to the point of it becoming an appointment viewing element of Nitro every week, WCW decided to add a new title to their lineage. Unsurprisingly then, given the level of talent they had, this one would be held by some true superstars. We're talking about names like Rey Mysterio, Eddie Guerrero, Chris Jericho, and Dean Malenko here. Unfortunately though, none of this would be enough to stop WCW from going out of business in 2001. So would this be the end of the Cruiserweight title then? Far from it, as from 2001 onwards, it would become a part of the WWE roster instead. And while WWE would never put it on quite the same pedestal that WCW had, it would still get to be the centerpiece of some great matches featuring some great talents here. Talents like Tajiri, Chavo Guerrero, and the Hurricane. Like with the Hardcore title and the European title, however, the WWE would end up losing interest in the Cruiserweight strap. And that led to it being deactivated in September of 2007, not long after its last holder, Hornswoggle, won it. Thankfully then, this would not be the last we saw of the Cruiserweight strap, as in 2016, WWE would revive it under an all-new lineage, with the first holder of this new belt to be held by the winner of the inaugural Cruiserweight Classic. Who would that be? None other than TJ Perkins. Not that he'd be the only person to hold this version of the Cruiserweight title over the next few years though. No, whether it be on 205 Live or Raw, various other people would make the belt their own, with some of the most notable names who did so probably being Neville, Buddy Murphy, and Leo Rush. And over time, as the prize became an NXT exclusive one, up-and-comers on that brand like Santos Escobar and Carmelo Hayes would also get their own runs. When it comes to Hayes though, he'd be the last person to hold it, as it was in January of 2022 that it was once more deactivated. Will we see it return again sometime down the line for a third time? It's certainly possible, as there's still a lot of positive fan opinion on the Cruiserweight strap, certainly a lot more than our next entry, WWE's inaugural attempt to start their own high-flying division back during 1997, the Light Heavyweight title. Well, we say that this one started in 1997, but in truth it actually goes back further than that, as the belt, which would come to be known as the WWF Light Heavyweight title, was first introduced in 1981 as part of Mexico's Universal Wrestling Association. Sure, it would technically be a WWF-sanctioned belt here, but like with the international title in modern-day AEW, this one was more of a traveling belt, and so it was generally used to represent the promotion elsewhere. Come the late 90s, however, seeing the success WCW were having with their own Cruiserweight division, WWF decided they needed to bring the belt back home so that they could start their own counter brand. The only problem with this, though, was that Vince McMahon's idea of Cruiserweight wrestling back in 1997 involved people like Scott Putski, a man who was clearly not light enough for the division as he weighed over 250 pounds. Sure, you would get some true Cruiserweight stars like Taka Michinoku or S.A. Rios sprinkled in there too, but overall, this one never had the same level of prestige as its southern counterpart. And that became especially true as the Attitude Era took full swing and the title turned into more of a comedy prop to be carried around by the likes of Gilbert, something which only ended what credibility it had by then. And so it was that when WWF purchased WCW in 2001 and came into possession of their Cruiserweight title, the one with the far more impressive history attached to it, they decided to quietly get rid of the light heavyweight belt, with them thinking so little of it here that they never even gave it an on-screen send-off. Yes, rather than the gold being merged with another belt or simply retired on TV, it would just disappear when the man then holding it, X-Pac, went down to an injury in March of 2002, with it never to be referred to again when he finally did return. And for this reason, we don't see it ever making a comeback. No, if WWE ever wanted to revive their Cruiserweight division once more, they have the Cruiserweight title for that. A much better option. Not that this makes the light heavyweight title unworthy of discussion, of course. No, it still has its place in history as a noteworthy mid-card belt in the WWE's history, and one which was held by some important names over the years. Just as every other belt we've looked at today has a similar level of importance, as they all show how crucial it is to give the mid-card something to fight for.